Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of the final episode of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard called The Last Generation, and in my opinion it was kind of disappointing. Even though it had a lot of things I liked and it had a lot of eye candy, a lot of nice character moments, the overall story was, I guess, okay, passable, but the details are terrible, the overall story doesn't really make sense if you think about it. And because it was also convenient, so easy, so predictable, it was barely an inconvenience and so much fan service, it felt as if I'm watching maybe not a parody but definitely a fan movie. And actually it reminds me of my own writing. When I was a kid, I used to write Star Trek fanfiction stories, and I even drew a comic showing the Enterprise flying into some giant ship to blow it up from within, just like in Star Wars, and so I was doing that kind of thing myself as a kid. And I wish I would have kept all that stuff to show it to you, to show the similarities, but the few stories that I did find as an adult from the time I was a kid, I didn't really like them anymore. Like, it was cool ideas, but it was kind of done in a silly way. And so that's how I feel like when watching this episode. That it is kind of fun, it is giving me what I wanted to see as a kid, but it's not really clever or realistic, it's all too convenient, too contrived, and just feels like fan fiction. And also it has the same kind of logical problems as the first season of Picard, which was one of the reasons I kind of hated that season. They had that whole thing with Soji choosing to open the portal for the evil AI tentacles to come and destroy all life in the galaxy, and it was completely her choice. And in the end, Picard had to talk with her to convince her not to do it, and then somehow she's the hero of the show because she chose not to kill everyone. Somehow everyone forgave her, and they do the same exact thing here with Jack, who apparently could have snapped out of his assimilation at any moment, so it was completely his choice to try to assimilate everyone, and he thought he's doing everyone a favor, I guess, even though the Borg fleet was targeting all the major cities, and he was the one sending that signal, so was he not aware that's what's going to happen? And when Picard manages to convince him not to do it, he can immediately easily snap out of the collective easily, and so it was all his choice all along, and so that destroys his character. And then a year later, he's somehow an ensign in Starfleet. How come he's not in prison for what he did? Didn't he just kill thousands of people? I guess he lied to everyone and said he was under the influence of the Borg Queen and he wasn't really acting by his own free will, but that's not what we saw. We saw that it was his choice, and Picard barely managed to convince him not to kill everyone, and then he could immediately snap himself out of the Borg collective somehow. And also, when all the assimilated ships were targeting all of Earth's cities, they kept targeting every major city, but not one ship fired at any city. Like, they kept only targeting and preparing to fire. So that's exactly like in Season 1, when the Romulan fleet was about to bombard the android village, and they kept preparing the weapons, and they kept powering up the weapons and targeting it for many scenes and never firing. And that was really annoying, the way it was dragged out to allow the heroes to save them. And so exactly the same thing happened here. And so these are the kind of things that can be fixed with editing. If we make it a bit shorter, if we cut out some of this stuff in between, maybe it will flow better. But the way it was done just seems kind of silly. Also, how come Space Dock is even able to withstand hundreds of starships firing at it for so long in this whole episode? Everyone keeps firing at the Space Dock, and I guess the Space Dock is creating the shield around Earth. That's why they cannot just go to the other side of the planet. Like, the Space Dock is the shield generator of Earth, apparently. And how come it wasn't taken over from within by the assimilated people? And if this whole thing was planned for so long by the Borg and the Changelings, how come they couldn't just put some bombs inside the Space Dock and just blow it up in this moment and then immediately attack Earth? Like, why does it take them so long if they supposedly planned for this whole thing for so long, so meticulously, and yet they didn't have a plan to take out the Space Dock if it needs to be taken out? And I guess it wasn't taken over from within because maybe not as many people use the transporters inside the Space Dock. Maybe starships use them a lot more often than the Space Dock people because they go to other planets and all of that, while in the Space Dock they just use the turbo lifts, and so maybe that can be the explanation, but they never explained it in the show itself. And why didn't they just beam a bunch of assimilated people onto the Space Dock before they knew what's going on instead of trying to attack it immediately? Like, when they took over all the ships, why not simply send a bunch of people to beam over to the Space Dock and then take it over? or put some bombs inside of it. Instead, they chose to attack it, and then apparently it has the most powerful shields in all of the Federation, because it takes hundreds of ships at least an hour to get through its shields, and so that was a little bit ridiculous, the amount of firepower they unleashed on it, and it was totally okay for as long as needed for the heroes to save the day. It was kind of unbelievable, especially since they kept saying, the entire Starfleet is going to be here. If they didn't say that, if they just said there's going to be many ships, but not the entire fleet, because it doesn't even look like the entire fleet. So why did they keep saying that across the whole season? And also something funny I forgot to mention in the previous episode, they were listening to the fleet communications and seeing that the Excelsior crew managed to retake the ship from the assimilated crew members, but then the other ships destroyed it. All the other ships fired at it and destroyed it. But wasn't the Excelsior the same ship that Elnor served on, as we saw in the previous season? So I guess they killed off Elnor off screen without ever mentioning it. Maybe he was one of the crew members who was able to retake the ship because, he has a sword, so he can easily cut up anyone he wants. Maybe he ran on the walls like in the Matrix and just cut off everyone's heads, and that's how they retook the ship. But then the rest of the assimilated fleet fired on it and destroyed it. But it's kind of a funny detail that I guess he got killed off and was never even mentioned, and Raffi never cried about it later and all of that. So that's just a funny detail. And as I predicted, Raffi and Seven were able to easily retake the Titan from the assimilated crew members, because they had some experience in the previous season fighting off assimilated soldiers. Even when they didn't have any guns, they only had a couple of knives, and they ran out into the field to kill a whole bunch of assimilated soldiers with weapons, and they only had knives, and they somehow were able to do it easily. And so the same thing in this episode, they somehow retake the entire ship, and they show that Raffi is using some kind of gun that when you fire it at someone, it transports them to the transporter room, which is locked, and that way you get them all locked away. And Seven says something about, oh, you invented the first weapon that can beam someone away, or something like that. And that line annoyed me because that idea was already used even back in TNG. There was the episode Gambit in which they said those mercenaries were using a gun that can teleport someone away when you shoot at them. And also in Star Trek Insurrection, those flying drones were shooting darts at people that when it hits someone, it beams them away. So it's not a new idea. And yet Seven says, oh, you invented this cool device that when you fire at someone, it beams them away, but it's nothing new. And why do they even need to use a gun to do it? Why not use a tricorder to do it? Like, it doesn't really make sense in this situation. And also they beamed all the assimilated crew members into the transporter room, but there is no force field, they just lock the door. And so obviously later on they are able to break free, and so that also annoyed me. Why not put a force field around them, which we know is possible in the transporter room? And so Seven and Raffi easily take over the ship. And then throughout this whole episode, they're buying time, I guess, for the Enterprise to save the day by flying and shooting at the hundreds of ships to delay them, I guess, which also made no sense. Why not join forces with the Enterprise D to actually save the day in the only way it can be saved, by cutting off the Borg transmission, which is causing all of this? And so it's just illogical because one ship is insignificant compared to the power of 1,000 starships that we see here. And we do have cool shots of hundreds of phaser beams being fired and all that kind of stuff, which was kind of good eye candy. But what the Titan is doing makes little sense. And they're using their cloaking device to avoid the enemy fire, I guess, even though wouldn't they lose shields when they cloak, and wouldn't that be even more risky? And they say that they know that the Enterprise D is near Jupiter, trying to disable the Borg. They know that, so why don't they jump there to help them? Isn't that more important than trying to slow down the fleet a little bit? Wouldn't the most effective way would be to go and join the Enterprise D to fight against the Borg? And also there was a moment when one of the crew members who helped them retake the ship is some chubby guy who is kind of cowardly, and he tells Seven that he never finished his piloting lessons, that he's actually the ship's cook, that he's not fitted to be at the helm. And then she tells him, no, you're the pilot now, and that's it. And that guy is constantly cowardly and all of that. And that kind of gave me Discovery vibes, because in Discovery they constantly had those minor male characters who are incompetent or cowardly, and often got killed off in the end. So I was thinking they're doing something like this, but at least they never killed that guy off, and Seven gave like a pep talk to him to man up for the job, and then he does. And so I guess it's not as bad as in Discovery, but it still kind of reminded me of that. It's the same kind of scene of humiliating some inferior male specimen. So it wasn't nearly as bad as in Discovery, but it kind of reminded me of that, so I had to mention it. And meanwhile, the Enterprise D is flying toward the solar system as well. And what is their plan exactly? I have no idea. I said in the end of my previous review that the only way to save the day is to find the source of the Borg transmission and to cut it off. And they don't yet know where it's coming from, and yet they're flying toward the solar system for some reason, and it just happens by coincidence that the Borg cube is also hiding in the solar system. Guess where it's hiding? Inside Jupiter for some reason. I guess they thought no one would see them inside Jupiter, even though there are colonies and space stations even in Jupiter's orbit, as we've seen in the older Star Trek shows. But you know, in the new Trek shows, they keep thinking the entire solar system is uninhabited. It's only Earth and maybe Titan which has any human presence on it. The rest of the solar system seems to be completely devoid of any civilian ships or star bases or anything. It's completely empty for some reason. And so no one noticed the Borg, and also not a single civilian ship tries to help in this whole crisis. I guess it can be explained away by that transmission from Earth's president, warning everyone to get away from Earth. You know, just like in Star Trek 4, there was that transmission by the president of the Federation to stay away from Earth. Throughout this whole season, they've been kind of copying parts of the Star Trek movies, and I'll probably do a long compilation of all of that stuff because it would be funny of how much stuff they recycled. At least they're recycling Star Trek movies and not other types of science fiction movies like Discovery kept doing. Like every episode of Discovery would rip off some other science fiction movie which is not Star Trek. So this season at least feels more like Star Trek because they're ripping off ideas from Star Trek and not from other places. And guess who is the president of Earth? We hear the voice of Chekhov. Chekhov is the president. Isn't he like 200 years old by now? And then they reveal it's not actually him, it's his son, who I guess looks exactly like him. They never showed him, but you know, in Star Trek, all your ancestors look exactly like you. And so that's why he has the same voice, and his name is Anton. I guess in memory of the actor who played Chekhov in the reboot movies. And another thing that annoys me is that I seem to remember that in this season, they mentioned that the leader of the Federation is a chancellor and not a president, and yet here it's a president. So did they forget their own writing again? Or maybe it's just the president of Earth and the Federation has a chancellor now. I guess we'll never know because the writers themselves don't know. So he warned everyone to get away from Earth because I guess he thinks the battle is lost, even though he's saying there's always hope. So make up your mind. Do you want people to try to help you or not? Where are all the civilian ships of the Federation? How come no one shows up to help? And only the Enterprise D is the only ship in range, I guess. It was in the Fleet Museum in another star system, but it's able to arrive in a few minutes somehow. And at least when they showed the Enterprise D flying, it didn't use the hyperspace effect. It actually looked more similar to the warp effect from TNG, you know, with stars zipping by. And they actually used the piece of footage from the opening of TNG, which is kind of strange here. Was that nebula always near Earth? Is that what they're showing, that the Enterprise is flying through the same nebula that we always saw in the opening of TNG? And why are they even flying toward the Sol system? They didn't yet know that the Borg are also in the Sol system. And just by coincidence it is. By total coincidence it's hiding in Jupiter. And then the stupidest part of the whole episode is that the Borg themselves just opened up their own shields to allow the Enterprise D to get to them. And there is absolutely no explanation for it. And so the villains defeated themselves. They opened up their own defenses and allowed the Enterprise D to get in there and to beam people into the cube and to defeat them. So why? Why did they open the shields? Why didn't they just fire at the Enterprise D right away, since they did have weapons? We saw that later. So why did they open their own shields to allow them to come in? Like, if it was kind of a trap, like if someone said, why are they opening the shields? It's probably a trap. And then later we find out what the trap is, and yet they still somehow managed to overcome it, then it could be okay. But there was no logical reason for why the Borg opened up their own defenses. I guess the Queen was just crazy. She's insane. She wanted to gloat over Picard, and that was more important than actually winning this operation, which is also apparently the Borg's last hope, because the Borg apparently have been totally weakened and decimated, and the Queen says that she remained all alone without a collective, and that it's basically all that's left. What we see in this episode is just a few Borg drones, and it's all that's left. Because the Borg have been poisoned, I guess, by Janeway, that's what they mean. You know, it could have been cool if they said this is the same Queen that escaped from that Borg cube in the first season of the show. That cube that was crippled by sadness because a Romulan who saw that vision of the AI destroying everything, she got assimilated by that cube, and because of her sorrow and sadness, it somehow crippled that cube. and they said that the Queen escaped the cube by using that long-range transporter or something. So if they said that's the same Queen from that cube that was crippled, and that she barely escaped, and maybe she went a little bit nuts from that same event because she also saw that vision, and it drove her crazy, and maybe that's why she's so weakened and all of that. If they tried to somehow explain all of this, maybe I could have accepted it, but the only thing they did say is that the Borg were poisoned, so I guess they mean the same virus that Janeway used against them, even though we saw other cubes still being in operation in Star Trek Prodigy. They mentioned that they are still infected by that virus and so they are weakened, and yet they can still function, they are not completely dying, and yet this Borg cube is apparently all dying and all her drones died. She's barely alive. I guess it fits that line from the previous episode when Troy said whatever is influencing Jack is ancient and weak, and so I guess they did it to explain it, or maybe they just did it to save money by not showing many Borg drones inside the cube. So they walk around there and most of the Borg drones are dead or decaying, and only a couple of them fight Riker and Worf when they beam over. And they didn't know that's going to be the case when they beamed in. How did they know there's going to be so few Borg drones? How were they going to fight their way through the cube if it was a normal cube with millions of drones inside and they barely brought any weapons, and they're so surprised that the Borg are so weak? So I guess they're extremely lucky. In this whole season everything happens by complete coincidence, which somehow all works out perfectly by sheer luck. And by the stupid decisions of the enemy. Like, why did the Borg lower their shields to allow them in was never explained, and so that's the stupidest part. I guess because the Queen is just crazy. That's the only way to explain it. So I guess she was crazy ever since she saw that admonition vision from season 1, and she escaped that Borg cube before it was crippled, and she was stuck somewhere alone on the edge of Federation space or something, and so she had very little drones with her. And also I see a lot of confusion in the comment section. A lot of people seem to don't get why do the evil Borg still exist at all. Didn't Jurati take over the Borg and they all became good? But I don't think that would have made sense either, because that would mean the entire timeline changed, and yet in the end of season 2 they implied that everything happened in a closed loop kind of situation, and so the bigger Borg, the bad Borg, still existed, and Jurati simply created some other smaller collective, and maybe she only had that one vagina ship, and maybe that's all she had. And so also they never bothered to call her for help in this whole season. Like when the Titan was on the run from everyone, how come Picard never considered going to Jurati and asking her for help, especially after they found out that the Borg are the villains of the season? Why didn't they go to Jurati to ask her to help out, since it would make sense, since she can link with the other Borg or something? So none of this makes any sense if we actually think about it. So I'm actually doing my best to try to explain it, because I want to enjoy it. I want to watch this episode without the constant distractions of all the details that don't add up and don't make any sense, which take me out of it. So my explanation is that the Queen we see here is the same one that escaped the cube that we saw in season 1, and she wasn't able to reach the heart of the collective, and that's why she's acting crazy and opening up her own shields. So I guess the Queen just wanted to gloat at Picard because she took over his son and she wanted to see his face, and that's why she allows him to beam over. And it is the voice of Alice Krige, but it's played by some other actress, and they try to put a lot of makeup on her to make it less obvious, I guess. And the makeup itself is pretty good, like it is very creepy. It kind of reminds me of the Giger style from Alien, you know, the biomechanoids and all of that, and so I actually kind of like the makeup. But I don't like how the Queen is basically powerless. She barely has any drones working for her. She does have a personal force field when Picard shoots at her, and we see it's made up of hexagons, like in all the new Trek shows. That's something I constantly poke fun at, that suddenly in all the Trek shows, in all the time periods, force fields are always made up of hexagons, and also in this episode, when we see the Earth shields falling, they also apparently are made up of hexagons. And so I don't know why in all the time periods with all the different species, suddenly most force fields are made up of hexagons. For some reason, I guess they just saved up that special effect and they're reusing it in different variations, and so that's why it's always like that now. So unfortunately the Queen is not played by Alice Krige, but it is her voice, and the makeup itself is kind of creepy, so I do kind of like it, even though it kind of negatively reminds me of that scene in Rise of Skywalker when the Emperor returns and he's also hooked up to life support and he's kind of decaying and all of that, so it kind of reminds me of that in a bad way. And also all of this reminds me of that old clip of Michael Jackson, which I think was called Captain EO, in which he was like a science fiction character going into some evil ship, and then there's a kind of evil witch there who kind of reminds me of the Borg Queen. I actually think that might have been one of the original inspirations for the Borg Queen in First Contact, because that clip actually predated that. That was from way back in 1986. So that could have actually inspired the Borg Queen, and the Queen we see here actually looks even more similar to that evil witch we saw in that Michael Jackson clip. So maybe it's actually all taking place in the same reality. Maybe it was Michael Jackson who weakened the Borg so much. With his dance-off powers, he's the one that transformed many of the Borg drones into his dancers, and that's what weakened that Borg Queen so much. And so it's all thanks to Michael Jackson that this Queen is so weak and crazy, and why there are so few drones, because he took most of them with him after he freed them from the collective. So there are only like a couple Borg drones in the entire cube, and Worf and Riker fight them off, and Worf is finally using a sword in a setting that makes sense. That's something I was saying across the season. Why is he constantly using his sword? And that it would only make sense if he was fighting something like Borg drones who get adapted to phasers, and then it will make sense to use a sword. And yet they kind of do the opposite here. So suddenly it's revealed that his sword contained a phaser all along, and he pulls off the phaser to shoot the Borg drones. And then Riker is angry at him. You had a phaser hidden in the sword all along. Why didn't you use it before? And then Worf says, because swords are fun. So I guess that explains why he was cutting off people's heads this entire season. He simply enjoys it more compared to just shooting someone. So that's why he was using a sword all this time. And I actually like how the interior of the cube looks much more like the cubes we saw in TNG, and not like the one from the first season of this show. For example, on the ceiling we see those little pyramids. Why don't they try to shoot those? Because we know that disrupts the power system of the cube. And meanwhile on the Titan, they say that they know that the Enterprise D are fighting the Borg near Jupiter. Wouldn't it be more efficient to go and join the Enterprise D to fight against the source of the Borg transmission, instead of trying to slow down the fleet a little bit? And then as Worf and Riker are killing drones inside the cube suddenly decides to fire at the Enterprise D. Why didn't they do that from the first place? Why did they open up their shields to allow them to beam over and to get the ship closer? And Beverly Crusher is at the tactical station, and she suddenly becomes the best tactician in the galaxy, and she fires all the Enterprise D weapons better than they were ever used before. Maybe they should have had a line earlier saying that maybe Geordi upgraded the ship somehow, that it's even better than the old Enterprise D, because what we see in this episode is that it is much more powerful, much faster, much more maneuverable, and able to fire much more weapons simultaneously than ever before. And so they imply as if it's Beverly that is magically doing all of this, making the Enterprise much more effective in combat than it ever was before. And meanwhile the away team is able to determine where the transmitter is inside the cube, and they transmit that information to the Enterprise D, and we see like a map of the cube showing the route they have to take through the cube to get to the center to blow up the thing, and they say it's impossible, no one can make that flight, and then Data says I can, and Geordi argues with him for some reason, even though what choice do they have? They literally have no other option than to attempt it. The other option is to give up. And you know, Geordi across this whole season always wants to surrender and give up and not even try. Like, what other choice do they have in this situation except to try it? And so reluctantly he agrees to let Data try to do it. And then Data takes the ship into the cube, and he's flying through some internal tunnels and all of that, which looks very similar to that scene in Return of the Jedi when everyone were flying into the Death Star. It looks really similar to that. And Data seems to be enjoying himself and smiling as he's doing that, and then Troy says, why do I sense enjoyment? And that's kind of a continuity mistake with season 1 of the show, because remember when Soji met her, she said that he cannot read her, and Soji was also an organic, synthetic android just like Data is now. So why don't the same rules apply here? If she wasn't able to sense anything from Soji, why is she able to sense something from Data in the scene? And so the Enterprise is flying through this giant cube to get to the center, and they tell Riker and Worf they only have like a minute to escape, and Riker for some reason decides to stay inside the cube and not to beam out, just because he doesn't want to abandon Picard. And Picard is talking with the Borg Queen, and she constantly laughs at him, and I don't like the way the Queen is laughing. First of all, it's really cartoony, like an evil witch laughing, and also all the previous queens we saw before never behaved like that. They were always a little bit robotic, not as a normal drone, much more human, but they were never laughing in this way as if they have a sense of humor. And so the Queen is constantly laughing at Picard with an evil laugh, and he tries to free Jack from all those tubes. And by the way, Jack has been assimilated and he looks really similar to the way Locutus looked like, with that little red laser. And the Queen tells Picard that if he simply disconnects Jack, then he will die, that he has to choose to leave the collective. And those are kind of like the Matrix rules, that if you just disconnect someone, he will die unless he first chooses to leave the Matrix. And so they are going by the Matrix rules now, I guess. And so Picard decides to hook himself up to the collective to speak with Jack. And so he just picks a random tube and sticks it to his neck, and that immediately hooks him up with Jack, and he's able to talk with Jack in that vision, in which Jack is apparently in some euphoria, and he thinks he's creating a perfect universe in which everyone will be connected and there will be peace and harmony. But at the same time, we saw that he's ordering all the assimilated ships to attack and destroy all the cities of Earth. He's the one sending those commands, and so how can he think that he's doing everyone a favor by trying to connect everyone so there will be no more differences and all of that? And at least they have some kind of moral dilemma in this episode, because, you know, Beverly is the one at the tactical station, and Geordi tells her that we have to stop the Borg to save all of humanity, and so she basically has to sacrifice her own son. She has to kill her own son to save the rest of humanity, and she's apparently willing to do it. And so at least we had some kind of moral, ethical dilemma somewhere in this episode. And it was earlier in the same episode when she herself said that if Earth falls, then everything else will also fall, that the Borg will take over everything if they manage to take over Earth. And that's something that always annoyed me, even in the older Trek shows and movies, that whenever they said that Earth is so important, that if the enemy defeats Earth, then the entire Federation will collapse. And it always annoyed me, because it's kind of pompous and arrogant and egocentrical to say that Earth and humanity is the most important member of the Federation, even though they said that the Federation has almost 200 other member planets. And then later she has to make the choice to shoot at the Borg and sacrifice her own son to save all of humanity, and she does, and they do fire at that transmitter, and then it creates a chain reaction that will blow up the entire Borg cube. But Picard luckily is able to convince Jack to sever his connection with the Borg, and apparently it was all up to Jack all along. You know, I complained in the previous episode how it was his choice to go to the Borg in the first place, so he's responsible for all this mess and the thousands of people who died in the space dock and all of that. So anyway, Jack is able to free himself from the simulation and then frees Picard, and they're both totally fine, totally disconnected. You know, it could have been clever if they said that Picard is able to do it because of his positronic mind, because he's now not fully a human but a synthetic, and that's how he was able to hack into the Borg in this situation. But they never even mentioned that. They made it look as if it's totally normal, you know, just like Jurati in the previous season just took a tube and hooked herself up to the Borg Queen so easily. And so Picard does exactly the same thing here, and then they unhook themselves, and the Borg Queen is totally pathetic and powerless and unable to do anything, so she just kind of screams. But then the Enterprise is able to get to them and beam them up in the last second, and we see the Borg Queen is screaming and exploding, and everything explodes, and the Enterprise D gets out of the cube in the last possible second with a trail of fire behind it for some reason. And after the Borg cube explodes, suddenly all the assimilated crew members return to normal immediately. And so that seems also kind of too easy. So the Borg have been just a minor inconvenience in this whole event. You know, no one died. Jack easily managed to free himself just by his decision, just because Picard agreed to give him a hug. That was enough for him. That was more powerful to him than the influence of the Borg Queen and his dreams of making a perfect universe, even though he was going to blow up all the cities. And it was his decision to go to the Borg. So if he simply never went to them, none of this would have happened, and the thousands of people who died wouldn't have died. And so what do they do to him after all of this? They give him a promotion. I'm not kidding. I did like some of Picard's dialogue when he was convincing Jack to leave the collective. For example, Jack kept saying how everything will be perfect and all of that, and then Picard told him, perfection is not evolution, it is death. And there was kind of a silly flashback right before Jack turned good. He suddenly remembered all the good times he had with Picard on the Titan. Like all the times they went to the bar together, and the time when he was dying from a poisonous gas, which a changeling left him to die, even though the changelings were working for the Borg and they needed Jack alive to be able to pull off this plan, and yet that changeling almost killed Jack. And so he remembers all those happy times that he spent with Picard in the holographic bar, and the time he almost died in sickbay. And that was enough for him to discover the fatherly love and to be able to free himself from the collective. And also when Picard hooked himself to those tubes, he also saw flashbacks from First Contact, and even apart from Season 1 when there was those special effects of flying through the Borg cube. They reused some of that in this episode. So a lot of it felt kind of cheap and lazy, but at least the Enterprise D sequences were kind of good and cool, even though the Enterprise is suddenly much more powerful than it ever was before, but at least it's good eye candy, so I did kind of enjoy that. And even though it was kind of a Star Wars ripoff, the way they defeated the cube by flying into it and blowing it up from the inside wasn't really that original, but at least it looked good. And I also liked how they gave each character something useful to do, and at some point Geordi saw something with his eyes that the sensors missed, which helped them out, and at some point Troy suddenly remembers that she has telepathic GPS like she had in Nemesis, and that she can locate where Riker is using her telepathic connection with him, and then she suddenly took the helm and piloted the ship by herself, which was a scary moment because she's always the one to crash the Enterprise, and yet this time she didn't, so maybe it was kind of deliberate to put her at the helm to kind of redeem herself from all the previous times that she crashed the ship, and this time she didn't. This time she saved the day and was able to beam them all out in the last second. And Data was useful because of his positronic brain being able to pilot that elaborate route throughout the cube, I guess. Maybe there should have been a scene of him hearing the voice of Sung telling him to shut off the navigational computer and use the positrons. Use the positrons to hit the target. That could have been funny. And when they all return to the ship, Worf sits down on the bridge and then falls asleep immediately and starts snoring. And so I'm not sure I like how much of a comic relief Worf is. Like across this whole season, it's been mostly used as a comic relief character. So not really a lot of clever decisions by him. And again, everything happens by sheer luck. The fact that they succeed in anything is just because of all the coincidences. And then we see the Enterprise D and the Titan flying together toward the sunset, which is something I predicted we were going to see. And we see like a graveyard of starships all around them. So it's obvious that thousands of people died, and yet no one is ever going to hold it against Jack. Everyone forgave Jack that he's the one responsible for all of this. And he apparently got into Starfleet Academy and became an ensign in just 1 year. That's quicker than the J.J. Kirk in the 2009 movie finished the academy in only 3 years instead of 4, and yet Jack did it in 1 year because of nepotism, I guess. Because wasn't it mentioned in the previous season that Picard is the Chancellor of Starfleet Academy? I guess they forgot all about it because they never mentioned it in this season. They kept saying that he's retired, even though in other places he used his Admiral's authority to do things, and so the show never made up its mind on this issue. And so I guess because of nepotism, Jack got accepted into the academy and became an ensign in just 1 year, and Picard tells him how proud he is of him. And Dr. Crusher got promoted to an admiral, and she's now the head of Starfleet Medical or something, and she figured out a way to use the transporters to remove that Borg DNA from everyone who got infected, and also to detect the changelings. And so that whole build-up of the changeling story across most of the season was solved in one quick line of dialogue. Oh, by the way, we now use the transporters to detect who is a changeling and who is not, and that way they caught all the changelings. And also, all the people that the changelings replaced are all alive, because the changelings kept them for information, and so Tuvok is still alive, and all the people that the changelings replaced, most of them are alive and well. And then we have a scene with Tuvok in which Seven is debriefed by him, and she thinks she's going to be demoted or kicked out, and so she's going to resign. And then he tells her that actually he's promoting her to captain, because Captain Shaw actually recorded a message about her, actually praising her and recommending she'll be promoted. And so Seven gets promoted to captain and not demoted as she thought. And that's also similar to a scene from Star Trek 4 when Captain Kirk became captain, when he thought he's going to get a punishment. And so I'll probably do a long compilation of all these comparisons with the older movies, because there are so many. And we see that Raffi got a message from her family, who forgave her for everything. Suddenly they discovered that she saved the whole galaxy, and so now they forgave her about everything. But didn't she save the whole galaxy in season 1? Didn't they know about that? I guess all of those events got classified. They never knew that she saved the whole galaxy from the evil AI tentacles. And now they do know that she saved the whole galaxy from the Borg, and so suddenly her family forgave her immediately, and she got a new message from her granddaughter, who looks exactly like the same clip she was watching earlier in the season. And the voiceover of her ex-husband says to the granddaughter, say hello to your grandmother, and then she doesn't say anything, and then he says, oh, it's because she's shy, it's not because we're recycling the same footage from earlier, the only footage we had of that girl. So anyway, some of this stuff was kind of ridiculous. And then Worf comes in and she tells him that someone leaked all the classified documents to the media, and that's how her family knows that she's a hero who saved the galaxy. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known because they didn't believe her, I guess. So all the stuff she did in season 1, if she ever told them, they didn't believe it. They thought she's just a conspiracy nut and just crazy. And because it's now on the news, now they do believe it, and now they forgive her. And then Worf implies that he's the one who leaked all those documents to the media. So I guess if it wasn't for Worf's leaks, the galaxy never would have known what happened in all of these events, because Starfleet loves classifying everything, even when it makes no sense to classify it or even would be impossible. And Worf now gives her a hug, even though earlier in this season it was said that he hates hugging people. So he does hug Raffi, who he only knew for a week, but he doesn't hug his old teammates from TNG that he knew for 40 years. That's supposed to make sense somehow. And then we see that Data is having therapy sessions with Troy, and Troy apparently is really suffering from hearing Data talk too much about himself. And he talks about how he saw someone feeding his cat and it made him cry. That was kind of funny. And it's also funny how Troy seems to be kind of bad at her job, just like she was in TNG. So I do like the consistency. Well, she was useful a few times using her telepathy and not crashing the ship for once, being at the helm. But other than that, she's kind of a terrible counselor. You know, it's because of her that Jack ran away to the Borg, because of her unlocking his secret. If she just kept her mouth shut for one more day, then none of this disaster would have happened. It's because of her that Space Dock blew up, and somehow Space Dock is completely fixed just 1 year later. I think they added a 1 year later bit just to explain that away, and maybe to explain how Jack became an ensign, because they had a scene of putting the Enterprise D at the Fleet Museum and shutting it down, and Picard and Riker are wearing the exact same outfits, and yet it's supposed to be a year later, and that's how Space Dock is fixed, and Jack is suddenly an ensign, and they're going into the Space Dock together, and Picard asks Jack, what ship are you assigned to? And then they see the Titan, but it's revealed that the Titan has been renamed into the Enterprise J. And that kind of annoys me, because I think they only did that to save money on not creating yet another model, and especially not creating new internal sets, because this way they can simply reuse the same bridge set of the Titan that they've been using all season, and that's the same set from the Stargazer in season 2, by the way. So they're basically being cheap and not wanting to show us another Enterprise, so they just renamed the Titan into the Enterprise for some reason, and Seven is the captain of the ship, and Raffi is her number 1, which is also silly. Wouldn't that be kind of awkward since they're former lovers, or are they back together again? How will they serve together if they have emotions for each other? So all of this setup is kind of ridiculous. If it's meant to lead into some new show, I'm not sure I want to watch that, honestly, because they've killed off all the cool minor characters like that Vulcan lady, who I liked earlier in the season. I guess they killed her off only to explain why she's not doing a mind meld with Jack, and that's why they needed Troy. Like, if there was a Vulcan on board, they could have used her for a mind meld and would not have needed Troy, so maybe that's why they killed her off. And then when Seven is about to give the order to go to warp, Raffi tells her that she has to make up some special saying, because it's tradition that every captain has something unique he has to say, and that's the same joke they used in Discovery and in Lower Decks and even in the new trailer for Strange New Worlds, and I'm kind of sick of this joke and sick of this whole idea that each captain has to have his own special way to say engage to go to warp. And so Seven thinks for a moment and then smiles, and then she's about to say something, but then it cuts to the outside of the ship, because the writers didn't know what to invent, I guess, and leave it to our imagination, because they couldn't think of something. And the Titan goes to warp right next to Earth in the middle of the solar system, which is against regulations. And then it cuts to Guinan's bar again. Once again the same exact set of Guinan's bar, and this time it's the real bar and not the hologram, I guess. And the entire TNG crew are there, and Guinan is only mentioned and never shown because she's too lazy to actually work at the bar, I guess. They never showed her this whole season, and they're all laughing around, and Data wants to finish that joke he started in season 1 of TNG about the young lady from Venus whose body is shaped like a, and they cut him off again and not allowing him to finish that, and that really annoys me. And then Picard pulls out a deck of cards, and then they all go and play poker together at a round table, and the camera kind of goes above them, and it looks exactly like the same shot as in the end of TNG. So they're recycling the same exact scene from the end of TNG, and that's how they end the show. And I keep thinking, did Picard totally forget about his girlfriend Laris, whom he told he'll be back in just a few days, and she told him she'll be waiting for him on some planet in which there's a beautiful sunset and there's a nice bar there. So shouldn't they have had this whole scene in the end at that other bar that she talked about? They could have still used the same set, simply redecorate it a little bit to make it less obvious it's the same set, and set it on that same planet, and just have Laris be with them, or at least have a short scene with her, and then he can play poker with his friends. She can say, I have a diplomatic mission early in the morning, and then she can leave, and then they can play poker without her, but have some kind of mention of his girlfriend. You know, the whole point of the previous season was for him to overcome his tragic childhood so that he can finally allow himself to be loved and be with Laris, who loved him. And they did have her in the beginning of this season, and they were still lovers, and she told him she'll be waiting for him in a special bar on some other planet. So they had the final scene set in a bar. So why not simply have it be that bar that she talked about? And there's also a post-credit scene when Jack is settling on the Titan, and he's putting up a picture of his parents on the table, and I think it's taken out of some real-life event. And then suddenly Q shows up, and Jack asks, aren't you dead? And he says, why are you thinking in such linear terms? Which reminds me of, you know, what Borquin once said, of you think in such three-dimensional terms. And so I guess they're totally retconning the ending of season 2 when Q specifically said he's going to die. So I guess he didn't, or maybe he did, but this is a Q from before he died, because, you know, the Q is kind of a time traveler. So basically he's not dead. So they're retconning what was done in the previous season. And, you know, John Delancey is really great, and in the previous season he's one of the only redeeming elements, because as stupid as some of that plot was, he kind of made it work and made it believable because he's such good of an actor. So I guess it might be okay and might be good if they actually do something interesting with Q later on. And Jack asks him, didn't you say that the trial of humanity is over? And he says it's only over for Picard, but for you it's only beginning. And I'm not sure I like it, because it's basically recycling the same ideas again. Why can't they invent something new? Invent new aliens, new characters, new situations. Why are they only recycling what was done before? And this whole season has been recycling all the Trek movies from before and just doing them with the TNG characters. And so if they're doing a new series, it's going to be the same stuff again, only with the younger cast. And I'm not sure I would enjoy it if they simply recycle the same ideas again and again and again. And it's not as if it's all been done. You know, I hear some people say, oh, it's simply impossible to invent something new. Every possible idea has been done already. I don't think it's true, because there are so many science fiction ideas which were never adopted properly in live action before. So why not buy off those stories, pay off those authors, and make episodes with new science fiction ideas which we haven't seen on screen before? And there are such ideas, and that's what frustrates me about the show and about New Trek in general, is that they're only recycling stuff that we've seen on TV before. Why not take something that was only in writing and adapt it to the screen? Show us some new science fiction idea for a change. And that's part of the problem I had with this season. I'll make another video to talk about the whole season overall, and I will be making a lot of edits and compilations and mashups and spoof videos on my other channel, so check out all the links below. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss everything in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.